And yeah, let's talk about mentorship. Thank you so much for listening to me today. I promise not to waffle on too much. My name's Ramon, pronounce he, him. As Toby said, I'm in Vienna, in Austria. I've been here for 21 years. So I say I'm from Chile, but head of open source at CodeC and just dabbling in lots of, like Toby said, I really love communities. I like one thing I was able to very gratefully do was get to know the Ruby community in Berlin early on in my career and just fell in love with it. Y'all are so wonderful. And yeah, I love to learn. And I recently learned that one of the best ways that I learned is by trying to understand something well enough so that I can teach about it. And that's how I got into mentorship, which is what I'm going to tell you about today. So, oh, I forgot to say, if you want to follow along my slides, I've got them here at ramonh.dev/mentorship-stories.pdf. You can download them there and follow along at your own pace. Yeah, so in order for me to talk to you about mentorship, I thought it'd be nice to tell you a little bit about my background and how I came into mentorship, being mentored, and then into mentorship. And so what happened was that when I was in my early 20s, starting out my career and not doing very well at university, I was looking to move in with my girlfriend, and we were looking for apartments, and I didn't really grow up coding that much. Just, messed around with it, but never really turned it into much experience that I took into high school and then university. So I was just doing it at school and wasn't really doing so well there. But when looking for a job, I started looking at babysitting jobs and that sort of thing. And my girlfriend was looking at the want ads and sort of went like, hey, Ramon, check it out. Somebody's looking for a freelance Mac OS X developer. Just to give you an idea of how long ago this was, it was still called Mac OS X. So it was a while. And the reason that this stood out to us was because like that year I had bought my first ever MacBook, and I was like, I had installed Xcode and I'd made a sample iOS app, and I was feeling like I was on top of the world and I could do anything. So I got in touch with the person who was looking for a freelance Mac OS X developer. This also made it easier for me because as I'm going to butcher the word in German, Drittstaatsangehöriger, third country person, as a non-European citizen, it was harder for me as a student to find work. So freelance work actually fit in really well for me. So I got in touch with the person looking for a job. Name was Philip, and Philip said like, okay, great. Send me your CV. I sent them the CV, and they said, okay, let's meet and just to give you an idea of where this was, let's meet up next Monday at the Cafe Mozart. Yes, we are in Vienna. We went to the Cafe Mozart. There's an actual picture of the Cafe Mozart. So I went there for like the third time in my life, like graduation and a friend of my parents' wedding. Third time in my life, I put on a suit, and I went there and I was looking very smart, and I was very, very nervous. And Philip sat me down and he said like, Ramon, it's really nice to meet you. I really appreciated your email, and you seem like a very polite person, but you really have no experience. Why are you applying for this job? And I was just feeling a little bit daring that day. And I said, look, Philip, I just really think I've got something to offer here. I'm willing. I think I'm a fast learner, and I'm willing to learn. And I think I can do a good job of it. And I was very lucky. And I was very lucky that he took a chance on me. And he said, look, I can't put you to code yet, but I am looking for somebody to do some email support for my company, this macOS apps that he offers. And he said, well, tell you what, here's a book recommendation. He gave me this book. He recommended this book, the Cocoa Mac Programming for Mac OS X. Again, aging this book, 3rd edition from Aaron Hilgess. This is from Big Nerd Ranch. They wrote some wonderful books. I learned Android programming and Mac OS X programming from these books. This is not a picture of my copy. I don't know where my copy is. I lent it to somebody and I don't remember who. If you're watching and you have my copy, please let me know. Anyway, so I started doing this, and I very tentatively started to, he guided me around the code bases. He taught me Subversion, because yes, we were using Subversion at the time, not Git. And I was learning and I was making little patches here and there to the programs. He was actually, this is how I was introduced to Ruby. All of his build tool chains were written in Ruby, and he introduced me to Rails and the philosophy of Rails and test-driven development and all these things. And I'll never forget an email he sent me, I think 3 months into our working together. He sent me an email with the subject, and I immediately forwarded the email to my father. The email was titled, "Highly pleased with your work." And this email meant the absolute world to me. And I still have that subject memorized. I didn't even have to go into my Gmail to look for it. I just knew what the subject was, because it's one of those things that just gets ingrained into my memory forever. And I realized something at that moment. It took me quite a while. It was only then that I realized that Philip was very kindly, and to this day, by the way, we still work together. He was mentoring me. I mean, nowadays I also mentor him on a lot of things. I got him and taught him how to do CI stuff. That's another story. So, start of the talk, let's do the start of the talk thing where we look up an internet definition for what mentorship is. What I'm going to do today is show you what mentorship means to me, what I think it means to the community, and a couple of things that I've been doing learning mentorship over the last years, tips that you can reuse, as well as tell some stories. So, internet definition, mentorship, a relationship between two people where the individual with more experience, knowledge, and connections is able to pass along what they have learned to a more junior individual within a certain field. And I like to think that the TLDR is that it's a relationship between one person with knowledge to be passed on to the person with who's more relatively junior in an area. And I like this definition, but I think there's more to it than meets the eye, and that's what I want to work on with you today. By starting with saying that I think mentorship can really happen in a number of places. When you think of a mentorship, you think two individuals collaborating, be it within a remote space or within on one-to-one space. But I think it happens in much smaller bursts and in lots of other places. For example, I think mentorship can happen in a written form. Here's, for example, a GitHub screenshot that I took from my time at the Rails Girls Summer of Code. This was a project that I was so happy to be a part of for 6 years before it sadly came to an end in 2020. And this is a pull request that I made to this project, which is a Rails project, by the way, where I was making some updates for some filtering, and I got some feedback from my friend Max Klapradler, saying this looks solid. I added some small comments here and there. I think it would be a good opportunity to also clean up and remove some. What I'm getting at here is that he took the time to look at my code and give me some feedback on that. And I think that this carries so much weight in being able to shape me into being a better developer, or at least exposing me to some other ideas that I think will help with that. But of course, this doesn't just happen one-on-one. This also happens in group settings. What you see here is a photo from the Django Girls workshop where we were learning Flask. If you're not familiar with Flask, this is the Python equivalent to Sinatra. And this photo is very old, by the way. I think it's from like 2014, 2015. And what we're doing here is working collaboratively with learners, learning Flask, going through a workshop, and again, mentoring each other as we go. I was very happy to go there as a coach and just being able to help folks understand the concepts because it wasn't just an introduction to Flask, but also to programming, kind of like the Rails Girls or Code Curious events are. And of course, this isn't just between adults. I like to think that mentorship happens between adults and children. So this is a photo, also quite old, of us running our after-school activity, computer game programming, where we would teach kids to code games, primarily in Ruby, actually, using a gem called Gosu. I don't know if you haven't heard of it, check it out. It's a lot of fun. And again, I've given a talk on this topic before, but teaching children has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my career, just because the way this fresh perspective and these questions they ask are just extraordinary and really challenged my thinking. And of course, as I said before, it's not just one-on-one, it's not just in person, it's also remote. Here are pictures that we've shared from the Rails Girls Summer of Code, which I mentioned before, which is this yearly which was this yearly program where folks would crowdsource teams of folks who are from underrepresented groups to be able to get started in programming. And I love this because it took place all over the world, and I was able to help coach people in programming. What you see here, counterclockwise from top left, we've got folks from Colombia and Medellin, we've got people from India, and we've got people from Austria, just interacting around the world and learning from one another. And of course, it doesn't just have to be about tech and programming. Mentorship in the area of tech can also be about other areas that I'm skilled at, such as public speaking. One of my favorite yearly events is the Global Diversity CFP Day, where this is a photo that we took last year in 2020 before the global lockdown. And what it is an event to encourage people to submit CFPs, which, if you're not familiar with them, are calls for proposals to conferences, and help get over the hump of trying to figure out, for example, what to talk about, or what to write as an abstract, what kind of drafting a bio, which, if you're not familiar with that, it's hard. So I've kind of gone on for a while for what I believe to be mentorship, but I also want to elaborate on why be a mentor in the first place. The following I am very kindly borrowing from my friend Geddes. He wrote this book called the Mentorship Guidebook, and I highly recommend this resource because he gave 3 fantastic reasons to be a mentor, which may seem intuitive at first. It helps others. Your mentee, the person you're mentoring, you get to help them with their career, with their education, help them combat imposter syndrome, help them with their projects. It also helps you as a mentor. It helps you learn more about yourself. It expands your worldview. It, of course, helps make friends, allies, supporters. You learn stuff. You also find knowledge gaps. And I really like it because it helps me verbalize things and understand them better. And of course, as a community, mentorship, sorry about that. Mentorship helps us all as a community improve. We get to become a more inclusive, collaborative community by doing so. So before I get into some of the tips of things that I've picked up about mentorship in my time, I want to make a quick distinction between mentoring and teaching. Of course, this is only based on my opinion and my experience. I look at teaching more from like a school perspective with a teacher. And I like to think that teaching kind of goes one way, teacher to student. Whereas I like to think that knowledge sharing kind of goes both ways when it comes to mentoring, right? Questions are asked, things are verbalized, and the goal is for everybody to find improvements in their knowledge. And where better to start than in the beginning? Let's I think the first thing I want to advise you on, if you are interested in getting into mentorship, if you're intrigued by the idea, or if you've been out of the game for a while and want to get back in, when I start a new mentor-mentee relationship, I love to ask the question, what are your goals? What is it that somebody hopes to get out of this relationship? Really give my mentee the opportunity to verbalize what it is that they need, and sort of establish that from the very beginning. And more than that, not just at the beginning, but also regularly, because who knows, maybe as we go in this mentor-mentee relationship, as time goes by, these goals will change, these goals will adapt, and having a regular check-in, not just for us as mentors, but also for the mentee to be able to take a step back and say, actually, I don't want to go into, I don't know, graphics programming, for example. Excuse me. It allows us to stay focused on where we are and also have a better vision for where we're going moving forward. And I think that communication is something that is one of the many good habits that I try to instill into a mentee, because I think that mentorship in many cases is not just short-term, but also long-term. not just because we might have a mentor-mentee relationship that lasts a long time, but because the mentorship that I do with somebody will transcend. And who knows, someday in the future, elements of what I've done with my mentee will go into the mentorship that the mentee will provide to their mentee. Am I making sense? Yeah. And I think the biggest habit that I try to instill in somebody, especially from an early stage, and already doing so by performing this mentorship, is empathy. Putting myself into the shoes of my mentee and trying to remember, for example, thanks, Toby, thinking, for example, what it was like from the beginning to learn what it was like to learn, I don't know, the async await concept in JavaScript. I should think in Ruby. To learn, for example, active record, how active record works, how to avoid n+1 queries, put myself in that position where I was like, gosh, what was it like back then? And try to understand where my mentee is coming from, trying to remember that things that seem very clear, like active record, I say this naively, we had to learn those at some point. And I think that kind of spills into what I was mentioning before, effective communication. I think by communicating with my mentee, I can provide them a way to be able to, especially as a freelancer, communication is critical for me when I'm working with clients and I need to explain to them why this works, why this doesn't. If I need to be able, for example, to take the time to explain to them why it is that this will take 6 months as opposed to 3. Stuff like this. This also goes, by the way, Toby and I were talking about this earlier, but actually, about explaining ideas and concepts, justifying why it is that you made this choice of technology is really critical. And I think a good way to instill that habit that I have found is by asking challenging, narrowed questions. Not just myself, but the mentee. I don't know if it's happened to you before, but I'm wondering, has it ever happened to you that you'll be met with someone who is new to programming and ask the question, which programming should I learn if I want to work as a web developer? And I bet you're all saying the same thing that went through my head, which is, well, it depends. And I think this isn't a bad question per se, but I like to encourage my potential mentee to sort of say, hey, let's take a step back. What if we narrow this question down a little bit? For example, instead of asking which one should we learn, maybe ask which one should we learn first? And even that question can still be narrowed down a little bit more, in my opinion. Instead of saying which one is the definitive one, what's a good one? What's a good programming language to learn first if I want to work as a web developer? And that allows us to sort of start giving our opinion. And I think that's the key word there, opinion, which kind of rolls into my next piece of advice, which is to expose instead of impose. Now, this is actually something, again, something I was talking to Toby about, opinions. Like, I used to think that being opinionated might have been a bit of a down thing when I was a negative thing when I was younger, but I'm kind of coming around to them. And I bet we've all either been in this position or been confronted by this position. But over time, I have found that I myself as a programmer have become opinionated and have found opinions on things that I would like to expose. That is to show my mentee and say, hey, this is something you could use, but not say, this is it, this is the only thing to use, and this is why this is the only best way to do it. For example, and I'm just going to go through some examples here. Text editors. I'm a big fan of Vim. I understand why people don't like using Vim or why they would prefer using Emacs or Visual Studio Code or Sublime Text, or what was the one that was on Mac OS that was like lots of Ruby, lots of Rails was written in it, and the name escaped something mine. Text edit, for example. Yeah, there was another TextMate. Yes, thank you, TextMate. That was it. I never used it myself, but I remember it from like my learning days. Same goes for programming languages. I mean, we're in the Ruby meetup. We all love Ruby, but people might have different opinions. But if we can show the mentee, this is why Ruby works for us. This is why Ruby makes me happy. Same goes for coding styles. Again, doesn't really apply to Ruby, but for example, the position of curly braces, or I don't know, how verbose to make a variable name. These sorts of things vary from project to project, maintainer to maintainer. And if you can show to your mentee and say, this is why I like to do it this way. You can at least provide them with a set of tools that they can refer back to. Same goes for tech, by the way. I'm presenting to you on a Windows machine. I like Windows at the moment. I like to use it with combination with Linux for my day-to-day development. That doesn't mean it's the best way. It's what works for me. Same goes, by the way, for Git history styles. For one of the open source projects I've been working on lately, I discovered something commits. Oh gosh, something commits. I don't know why my brain is failing me today. Conventional, thank you. Yes, conventional commits. Exactly. Y'all are so good. Thank you, chat. Thank you, everybody at the meetup. Yeah, and by being able, and which has been like a revolutionary thing for me, but being able to show to somebody why conventional commits work very well for me might work for them and why not. And I just want to provide these tools to my mentee and by extension, be supportive. This kind of goes into the whole empathy thing from before. And I also mentioned imposter syndrome. If you're not familiar with it, imposter syndrome is a concept where folks come into an area and they kind of get the feeling that they've either like lied and cheated their way in there and they don't belong. You probably have experienced this before. It's pretty common. I, to this day, still feel it. I actually have a bit of a story there because I've realized that with programming, I've been able to sort of not ignore it, but definitely handle my imposter syndrome when I'm coming into a project that I'm less familiar with. I lately had to upgrade a code base from Rails 4 to 6. And I realized, oh my gosh, do I actually know Rails? And, you know, just taking a step back to remember, yes, and it's not so much about knowing Rails, but also being able to manage it, to being able to cut down on errors, doing some divide and conquer of issues so that I can get to that point where I was able to do that upgrade. And interestingly, as Toby mentioned, this year I started working in DevRel, and that was interesting because it was kind of a wave of fresh new imposter syndrome that I didn't have the tools that I had acquired over the last 10 years to handle. So that was really interesting. And again, those tools, those pieces of experience, that it is just that, it is your experience. And I think it's important to drive home to my mentee and tell them, hey, look, this worked for me, right? These are the things that I did so that I could handle my imposter syndrome better. Maybe they work for you. These are some other perspectives that I've heard of that have worked for these people. Connecting people. Now that I have a network, I can refer people within understanding that people have time and needs, to be able to say, hey, you know, this person had a similar experience to yours. I'm actually don't have a lot of experience with getting a master's degree, but you can talk to this person. And I think that's helpful towards reminding somebody that my experience is not the end all be all of being in tech. I mentioned an email earlier about how that changed my day. I'm wondering if any of y'all have ever had the experience where you've gotten some unconstructive feedback on your code. And I don't know about you, but I've gotten some in my time, and it has been absolutely devastating and exacerbated my imposter syndrome. So I make a significant effort with my mentee to give constructive feedback. And I find that my favorite tool to do that is something called guided questions. And what guided questions are they're questions that lead into a discussion that involve critical thought and critical discussion between myself and the mentee. So here comes some code, the only two slides of code in my presentation today. What you see here is an ERB template. That what we have here is a piece of code that I got from a pull request from my mentee. And what it does is it grabs a date and prepends to it the translation for the words on week and gets the week number, you know, like how, you know, in January 1st, it's week 1, end of year, it's week 52. And you all might be looking at this piece of code and seeing a couple of issues with it. For example, like a big code smell for me is seeing addition of strings with Ruby. I think like, oh, surely we could interpolate that somehow. Same with having a blank space string addition there. These are things that I've definitely picked up in university, but my experience with Ruby and Rails tells me something's not right here. So instead of just taking this piece of code, putting a big changes required kind of thing review on it, excuse me for 1 second. Instead of doing that, will sit down with my mentor and think like, okay, this is very functional. Thank you. Quick question. What do you think will happen in a language, in a spoken language, localized language, where the weak number is in the middle of the sentence, right? And I cannot for the life of me, and I've given this talk a couple of times by now, I cannot for the life of me think of a language where that's the case, but it doesn't matter because the point still stands. And so, and I'll let my mentee come to the conclusion, you know what? I can't actually think of one. And so what we'll do is we'll start looking into the possibilities of how to fix this, how to mitigate this. So I will guide, like I'll let them come to their own conclusions. We'll go on this journey together. We'll go into the I-18N GEM documentation, and we'll eventually find that it's actually possible, slide number 2 with code, to have variable passing to locales in Rails. So we can say, okay, we want the string for on week, and we'll pass to it a date, which is this week number. Oh, that's not a good variable name. My bad. But the point stands. So what we're doing here, and this was all written, this was the whole conclusion here. All it came from was one question from me. And the mentee was able to sort of go through this in a guided fashion. We discussed this along the way. And I really want to drive home how important it is to be constructive because, and I'm going to quote Kim Creighton. If you don't know her, she runs this organization called Profit Without Oppression, and it's a marvelous set of events, workshops. Highly recommend them. I should link them. I found this blog post from Will Larson. Sorry, the quote, maximize help and minimize harm are from Kim. And Will Larson wrote this blog post I really liked called Mentoring from Privilege. And I really want to drive home how important it is to invest into understanding my privilege as a cis white man and being able to put myself into the position within the ranges of empathy, but also discretion, and being very careful with my mentee if they're from a different level, if they're from marginalized groups, to not give advice on things that I don't know about. For example, as I said before, I don't have the perspective of what it's like to get a master's degree. So breaking into the technology industry from a boot camp. And I will not decline to give advice on it, but help the mentee come to resources that will help them in that specific situation. And the same goes for sharing my perspectives. I mentioned earlier how important it is to remind the mentee that the perspectives come from my experience, but also to remind them that this is not the way things work. But also you might be thinking, well, then why tell those stories in the first place? And I think it's important for the mentees. I'm sorry, I keep bonking my microphone. I think it's important for the mentee to take those perspectives and stories and draw their own conclusions from them. Same goes for being understanding of my privilege level and group and calling out behaviors that I think are not suitable or acceptable from that group that I belong to, or that I come from, sorry, and incorporate these counterpoint stories, bring in voices that help these people from marginalized groups being able to mentor each other and be menteed as well. I think, as you could tell, it's really important to me to keep my mentee in mind and really being attentive to them. I like to think of myself like when I'm mentoring someone, I kind of like to think of myself within reason, of course, as a off-the-shelf rubber ducky, right? If you're not familiar with rubber ducky programming, it's the concept where you have a rubber ducky that you explain problems and places you're stuck into. Yeah, we got a rubber ducky there. Nice. Mine's not a rubber ducky per se. I got this in a machine in Korea and I fell in love with it. It is a penguin doggo and I adore it. Anyway, yeah, and I like to think that I like to let the mentee talk to me. Like for me, I like to my approach is to listen when it comes to mentoring. And when it comes to an idea that my mentee will start telling me about, and even if I fundamentally disagree with that idea, even if I think it's completely wrong, I want to let the mentee voice it out in full for 3 reasons. One being respect, of course, letting someone be heard. Second, they might come to the conclusion as voicing their idea out that they're wrong and do the whole learning on their own and get such higher quality of learning from that. And third, who knows, maybe I'm wrong. And maybe hearing out that idea in full will help me reach a conclusion that I didn't think I had. And that whole part of me learning really drives home how important it is to learn together. I mentioned before when talking about privilege, how important it is to avoid giving advice on topics you don't know about. But it's not just about matters of privilege, it's also about technical things. How tempting is it to try and like lie through our teeth and be like, oh yeah, I totally know about this. And this is why you like, don't ask questions. Like I've been there, especially when working with kids. I got a story about that in a second, but I learned a phrase and it's one of my favorite phrases. And I use this so much when mentoring. When somebody asks me a question that I don't know the answer to, instead of being tempted to say, just, it's just this, or why is it this way? And I'll just be like, it's just that way. I like to follow that up with, you know what? I don't know. Let's find out. And go on a learning journey with them. And here's the example. When I was teaching kids to code, we were doing game design, as I said, as you can see in this expertly done vector graphic of what a game window looks like. I like what we're doing at this stage is teaching how to draw characters on the screen, and I'll explain coordinate systems to them. I'll tell them, all right, everybody, X is the horizontal coordinate and Y is the vertical coordinate. As the X coordinate gets larger and smaller, the character moves right and left respectively. When the Y coordinate gets larger and smaller, the character will move down and up respectively. So that means that when both are 0, the character will be drawn at the top left of the window. And I'll never forget, one of the kids goes like, oh, wait, hold on. I learned in math class, we're doing graphs, and I learned that when both are 0, that's at the bottom left. So why are computer people doing it like this? What's wrong? And I was tempted, time pressure and all that, to just be like, that's just that way. Let's leave it. But then I thought, nah, you know what? I'll answer. You know what? I don't know. Let's find out. And so we went on our favorite search engine and we looked it up and we found out it's actually quite interesting. Turns out that old monitors, what you see here is a CRT or cathode ray tube monitor. The way they display their images is by displaying the pixels like really, really fast, left to right, top to bottom. So it'll go like, it looks really cool. In fact, I actually have a GIF of it. So just giving you a heads up, there's going to be an animated GIF here. Somebody took one of those 10,000 frames per second cameras, like ultra slow mode cameras. There's a link to the YouTube thing here. And they recorded the game Super Mario Brothers in slow motion. Check this out. It looks like an existential nightmare and I love it. So you can see they're super slow. There's a link on YouTube, by the way. And this wouldn't have happened if the kid hadn't asked me the question and if I had the discipline to say, let's find out. So I kind of started adopting that into my daily life. I know I said I liked Vim, but I love just being able to look stuff up with my mentee and just be like, you know what, let's go look this up. Let's find out how to exit Vim. One of my favorite questions that I got at a Rails Girls workshop was, hey, Ramon, I got a question for you. Why is it called a div? Something I had never wondered in my life. And I didn't know at the time. We went and looked it up online. Fun fact, it's short for divider. I had no idea. But I love this curiosity because, and again, when I do have the answer, again, asking those guided questions, sort of making this learning experience an ongoing one and just showing that the curiosity is there. And what I like about doing this together as well, like it allows me to show my mentee how my process looks. I think it's super critical to be able to show that process. Like what I love doing, I do this while streaming as well. I love to talk out loud and just be like, all right. So a few weeks ago, I got stuck on a thing. There was, if you've tried and deployed a web app that involves NPM into a Linux server online, and you've seen the error 137, then you're probably familiar with that. I've kind of gotten very, very comfortable with knowing I'm out of, that's the computer saying I'm out of memory. Just going step by step as I go and just being like, okay, I recognize this error. It means I'm out of memory. I'm going to do the DigitalOcean walkthrough for setting up swap memory and that sort of thing. I think that allows, it kind of, you know what it does? It allows us to sort of demystify this notion that we as senior developers have all the answers, because we don't. Like, to this day, I still don't know which way a hash merge is going to go. And if you do know, kudos to you. I want to learn your secrets, because I still cannot, like which way will be overridden. I never know. And I like to take that opportunity to just admit, again, as I've said several times, admit that I don't know, but also do regular check-ins on deep dives and just be like, you know what? I'm glad you asked about, we're covering HTTP requests right now. Shall we go into a deep dive, and I'll take out a piece of paper and do the worst drawing you've ever seen of a computer and a server, and just like how they're interacting. Like, this is a request, it comes from the client, the server processes it, and just like taking the time to go into deep dives and passing resources. Like for, I wish I had a link to it. There are two websites that I really love. One is HTTP Cats, and the other one is HTTP Dogs, which are just adorable pictures of cats and dogs, respectively, to explain how all the error status codes for HTTP work. These are wonderful, and I love them. And these kinds of resources, like, they kind of transcend time, and they're also like being updated and super fun. Here's a couple that I always recommend to folks, like the regex crossword, which if you haven't checked it out, I highly recommend it. It's a fun game where you use regular expressions to solve funky crosswords. It's a lot of fun. Same goes for CSS selectors. I'll normally recommend something like CSS Diner. This is super fun because it allows you to learn how to write CSS selector for selecting plates, fancy plates, the plate with a pickle on it, that sort of thing. It's super fun. For Flexbox, I always recommend Flexbox Froggy. If you're learning Flexbox, it's a CSS layout tool. When it comes to more Rails related stuff, I love recommending Sandy Metz's Practical Object-Oriented Design. This is a fantastic book that I pass on to people. I do know who I lent that book to, though. That's with my sister. Yeah. Speaking of my sister, it kind of blends into my next point about how knowledge and experience are relative. This is a story that I have gotten her permission to share, and it's one of my favorites when it comes to mentorship. You see, what happened was she went to her first ever Rails Girls workshop to learn how to code and make a Rails app. This was to the west of Vienna in a town called St. Pölten. I'm about to out myself as a geography fool if it's not to the west, but I'm pretty sure it's to the west. Regardless, she went to that workshop, and it was her first experiences with coding. And after doing that, a couple of weeks later, she got approached by the organizer of that Rails Girls workshop and said, hey, we're about to have one in Linz, which is kind of halfway between Vienna and Salzburg, and said, hey, we're about to have this workshop in Linz. Do you want to come in as a mentor? This was a couple of weeks, mind you. And my sister said, I don't feel ready. Like, I just did this workshop a couple of weeks ago. What could I possibly offer? And the mentor said, the organizer said something that, again, I'll never forget. And he said that having that experience closer to that of a newcomer is so valuable. Like, being able to relate with somebody, again, empathize with somebody on those things that you didn't think you couldn't, things you got stuck on when doing the Rails Girls workshop. Installing Rails on Windows, for example, setting up SQLite 3 on Windows, these sorts of things. Again, I'm probably aging how long ago I did that. But yeah, these sort of experiences, just from familiarity, being able to be like, don't worry, I remember this being kind of hard, but this is how I understood it. Providing mental techniques that you have is super valuable. And I like to think that that goes the other way too. I like to think about when it comes to mentoring, just because I'm a senior software developer does not mean that I don't need mentorship, because there are other areas of software engineering that I don't know a lot about. For example, I don't know, graphics programming. And so somebody who's probably a junior in graphics programming can mentor me, a senior in web development, in graphics programming, for example. Having said that, I've been talking a lot about mentorship. I also want to talk about self-care, because, and this is probably something where I'm going to preface this with, do as I say, not as I do. It's so important to know your limits when you're providing mentorship and these kinds of relationships, because I have found that it's very easy to overload yourself and say like, hey, I can mentor, and then a bunch of people come in, and then you realize you are overwhelmed. And I've found with experience that if I take on too many mentees, that will have an effect on the quality of my mentorship. So I want to really drive home how important it is to take care of yourself and know your limits. I've been going on for a while, so thank you for your patience. I'm going to answer one last question, if I may, which is where to go to do some mentorship. And I just want to say, of course, this is a lot easier for when we're talking about local events. If there wasn't a global pandemic, but there are loads of online events that you can attend. For example, here in Vienna, I've got stuff like the Wien Coda Dojo for teaching children. There's lots of online workshops as well. Again, during local events time, there was stuff like Rails Girls and Code Curious and Rails Bridge, and well, that's more American, I think, and Rust Bridge, which was one of my favorite events I've attended. That's one thing you can do. There's also totally the possibility of hosting open advice one-on-one sessions. This was an idea given to me by my friend Jessica. What it is you'll just put up a notice online and say like, hey, I'm available for career mentorship or public speaking mentorship or any other kind of mentorship. And you'll just have these one-on-ones like for free usually, where you have a half-hour session with somebody one time or more than one time, totally up to you. Give them a link so that they can book a time on your calendar. I've been doing this for Spanish speakers over the last year, and it's been incredibly rewarding, and I highly recommend it. I'm still doing it now, by the way. So if anybody in the chat is Spanish speaking and looking for career advice, hit me up. If you, for example, got an open source project that you'd love to offer some mentorship on, and you've got some issues that you'd love to work on, but maybe don't have the time, totally offer, just tag these issues and be like, hey, I'm totally happy to like pair on this or do some ensemble programming on it. It's super fun and relatively hands-off, and it lets you, again, mentor somebody and let those ideas flow. If you're in a workplace that offers an internal program, totally find out. A lot of workplaces do offer an internal mentorship program. And if not, hey, maybe try and propose creating one. Of course, time and resources allowing for you as a person. One thing that I love doing is what are called communities of practice. This is the name for this came from my friend Joe Nash, who discovered it in the book Building Successful Online Communities. And what it is carries a lot of names. There's one in Berlin that I used to go to quite often, especially early on during the pandemic, called Rust Hack and Learn. We'll have one here in Vienna called Study Jams. And what it is just a session where folks will come in online or like lately online and just hack on whatever and just hang out, just usually with headphones or just like some snacks, some coffee, and talk about tech or find out about tech from one another, do some one-on-one mentorship, like I said, or some group practice talks. It's super fun. One thing that I've seen become very popular lately is this concept of learning in public. There are lots of folks out there who are just sort of, Maggie Appleton made this thing that she calls the digital garden, where you just sort of like, instead of having a blog, you have these interconnected thoughts and ideas and learnings, and you sort of cloud them together in this garden that you curate, and you sort of just map out what you're learning and then allow folks to come to you and say like, oh, that's interesting, let's do something more about that. And folks have been doing that over the last year. I've seen it a lot, and I found it incredibly rewarding. If you're interested in this sort of thing, I found the book Working in Public by Nadia Egbal really, really interesting in terms of like how to position that sort of online mentorship and open source maintainership. So I promise I'm done, and thank you for bearing with me. I just want to be a little bit cheesy, if I may. We've been talking about mentorship for a while now, and as you see, I have lots of ideas about it. And while I do think that mentorship is totally about sharing knowledge, another thing I'd like to tack onto that is that mentorship is also about sharing the joy of sharing knowledge. And I think that joy is what we really bring into the game as mentors. So thanks a lot for bearing with me, folks. Here's a bunch of resources that I've mentioned throughout this talk for some further reading. Highly recommend checking it out, even if just for the games. The slides will be online. And if you want to talk about mentorship, I'm at Hola Soy Milk on Twitter. And yeah, thanks everybody. I'm happy to answer any questions.